She thought she was boarding a plane to escape her abusive husband, but when she sat beside a quiet stranger with haunted eyes, her entire fate shifted. What if the flight she took by mistake was the only thing that could save her life? Stay with this story. It's not just about survival. It's about the moment everything changed. Grace Turner had always known how to disappear in plain sight. She'd learned early in her marriage that survival didn't always look like fighting back. It often looked like silence, like smiling, politely at dinner parties while a bruise bloomed beneath her collarbone, like excusing her husband's anger as stress, fatigue, pressure. Jonathan, after all, was a brilliant man, a professor at one of Boston's most prestigious universities, a rising figure in academic circles. People adored him, admired him. No one would ever believe the things he said to her behind closed doors, the things he did. For years, Grace had told herself it wasn't that bad, that he hadn't meant to push her, that he was just under pressure, that he loved her. But somewhere deep inside she knew better, because love shouldn't feel like fear. And being married shouldn't feel like being trapped inside a glass house, watching your own reflection disappear. It wasn't the bruises that finally broke her. It was the sound of her son screaming. That night, the argument had started over nothing. Leftover dinner, a misplaced bill, the way Grace had looked at him when he raised his voice. Jonathan had thrown a glass against the kitchen wall, and when Grace didn't flinch, didn't cower fast enough, his hand lashed out. The slap landed with a brutal finality. And from the hallway, a small, terrified voice cracked through the tension. "Mommy?" Grace froze. 6-year-old Noah stood barefoot on the hardwood floor, his stuffed dinosaur hanging from one hand. His little face was pale, lips quivering, eyes wide with something Grace had tried so hard to keep away from him. The truth. Jonathan turned toward their son, his expression shifting from rage to cold disdain. "Go back to bed," he barked. Noah whimpered and disappeared down the hall, covering his ears. Grace stood there, her face burning, the sting of shame deeper than the physical pain. She stared at Jonathan, the man who once read poetry to her, on park benches, who kissed her knuckles and called her his muse. That man was gone. In his place stood a hollowed-out shell fueled by power, pride, and fury. She knew, with the clarity of someone who had run out of excuses, that if she didn't leave now, she never would. And next time, Noah might not just witness it. He might become part of it. She waited until Jonathan passed out in his study, a half-empty bottle of bourbon tipped on its side. Then she moved. No panic. No second-guessing. Just the mechanical, deliberate steps of someone whose instincts had finally overridden fear. In their bedroom, she grabbed Noah's school backpack and stuffed it with essentials. 2 changes of clothes, his inhaler, a granola bar, and his dinosaur hoodie. She reached behind the closet shelf and pulled out a shoebox. Inside, wrapped in an old scarf, was a prepaid phone she had bought 6 months ago and hidden away like a secret key to a door she wasn't ready to open. Until now. She tiptoed into Noah's room, crouched beside his bed, and touched his shoulder gently. "Sweetheart," she whispered, "we're going on an adventure." His eyes fluttered open, dazed. "Is Daddy coming?" "No, baby," she said, voice catching. "Just us." He didn't protest. He simply nodded and reached for her hand. They walked through the darkened house in silence, the air thick with ghosts. Every creak of the floorboards made her heart seize. Every rustle of fabric felt like a siren. But they made it to the car. Grace didn't even allow herself a glance back at the home that had slowly become her prison. She drove through the quiet suburbs with the headlights off for the first 10 minutes, hands gripping the steering wheel, knuckles white. Her mind ran wild. Would Jonathan wake up and find them gone? Would he track her phone? Would he call the police and twist the narrative as he'd always done? Her original plan had been clear. Drive straight to her cousin's house in Santa Fe. It would take 2 days, but it was safe. Family. Untraceable. But by the time she reached a gas station outside Worcester, fear had begun to cloud her thoughts again. What if Jonathan had already figured out where she was going? What if he guessed her destination? The idea of him following them made her blood run cold. She parked behind the building, her hands trembling. There was an airport 20 miles away. She made a decision she hadn't planned, one she couldn't explain except by instinct. She turned the car toward Logan International Airport. Inside the terminal, everything felt surreal. Travelers bustled around them with coffees and carry-ons, oblivious to the woman with a swollen cheek and a child clinging to her side. Grace walked up to the counter and asked for the next flight. Leaving soonest. 2 seats left on a flight to Vancouver. the attendant said. Leaves in 30 minutes. Grace didn't ask questions. She paid cash and took the boarding passes. She didn't know anyone in Vancouver. She didn't even know where it was on the map beyond far away. That was all that mattered. At the RCA gate, Noah curled into her side, exhausted. Grace wrapped her scarf tighter around her face, hoping it concealed the worst of her bruising. Her stomach churned with anxiety. She hadn't even brought a charger. The prepaid phone was already dying. But they were leaving. And that was enough. They boarded last. Their seats were near the back. She helped Noah into the window seat, tucked his hoodie around him, and kissed his forehead. He fell asleep within minutes. The kind of deep, unbothered sleep only children are capable of after emotional exhaustion. Grace sat down beside him, her body aching. Her mind screamed, what now? What if she was making the biggest mistake of her life? Excuse me, a voice said beside her. Is this seat taken? She looked up, startled. The man standing in the aisle was tall, maybe mid-30s, wearing a plain grey sweater and jeans. He looked worn, not in a disheveled way, but in the way people look when life has pressed its thumbprint into them. No, Grace murmured, barely audible. He gave a small nod and settled beside her, tucking a leather satchel under the seat in front of him. He didn't glance at her again. Didn't try to speak. Just rested his head back and closed his eyes. For a few minutes the plane hummed with quiet motion. People finding seats, luggage being stowed. Noah's breathing steady beside her. Grace felt the man's presence, but not his pressure. That, in itself, felt unusual. As the plane taxied, Grace gripped the armrest, not because she feared flying, but because she was suddenly, deeply aware of everything she had just left behind, and everything uncertain that lay ahead. The plane lifted. Boston disappeared beneath the clouds. And without warning, tears welled in her eyes. Not loud sobs, just quiet, unstoppable grief. The kind that leaks from the soul when it's carried too much. She turned toward the window, ashamed, trying to hide it. Then, without a word, the man beside her reached into his pocket and offered her a tissue. He didn't look at her. Didn't comment. Just extended the gesture like someone who understood pain but didn't need to dissect it. Grace accepted it with shaking fingers. Thank you, she whispered. The man nodded, eyes still forward. They didn't speak again for the rest of the hour. But something had shifted. In the space between two strangers on a plane, neither had planned to be on. Something fragile and unspoken began to form. Not hope. Not yet. But the first breath that comes after you stop holding it. The kind that whispers, you made it out. And maybe, just maybe, you're not alone anymore. Grace didn't sleep on the plane. Even after Noah drifted off beside her, his head resting gently against her arm, his small hand still gripping his stuffed dinosaur, she remained tense, upright, her body alert as if danger might appear at any moment. The cabin lights had dimmed, and the hum of the engines offered a kind of lullaby. But for Grace, the sound only emphasized how foreign this stillness felt. Her entire nervous system had been wired for survival for so long that even now, soaring thousands of feet above the life she had just fled, she couldn't quite convince herself that she was safe. She found herself glancing at the man beside her, the one who had offered her a tissue with quiet kindness. He hadn't spoken since, hadn't pried or even looked at her again. There was a stillness about him, the kind not born of apathy but of something learned, something endured. He had the posture of someone who had once been broken but chose not to shatter. He noticed her glance just barely and shifted to the side to give her more space. It was such a simple gesture, yet it struck Grace deeply. She was used to men who took up space, who demanded attention. This stranger simply existed, aware, considerate, present without intruding. Grace turned her face back toward the window, watching the scattered lights of distant cities blink far below. Her thoughts spun endlessly. What was she doing? Where? Was she even going? She didn't know a soul in Vancouver. The plan was no plan. Just movement. Just escape. But sometimes movement was all you had left. She whispered a silent prayer, not to any god in particular, but to the quiet force within her that had kept her alive this long. Please let this be the beginning, not just another hiding place. The man beside her stirred. Grace's eyes flicked, toward him again, cautious. First time going to Vancouver, he asked, his voice low, unassuming, not an attempt at small talk, but something quieter. A bridge. Yes, she replied, her own voice soft, guarded. He nodded once. It's beautiful. Cold this time of year, but peaceful. She didn't answer right away. Then, feeling something in the tone of his voice, something sincere, she added, I wasn't supposed to go there. I just needed to get away. His eyes met hers briefly. I understand. Something about the way he said it made her pause. Not I understand as in I'm sorry, not pity. It was the understanding of someone who knew what it meant to run, what it cost to leave. I'm Grace, she said after a long silence. He gave a small nod. Lucas. The name sat between them, like folded notes not yet opened. After a while, Grace leaned back in her seat, letting her eyes rest though not fully closing. When the plane finally landed, her muscles tensed all over again. The soft thud of wheels touching down felt more like a warning than a welcome. Vancouver International Airport was still cloaked in pre-dawn silence, the kind of grey light that made everything seem unreal. Passengers slowly filed out of their seats, dragging bags and children, stretching limbs stiff from the flight. Grace helped Noah out of his seat, careful not to wake him too much, and gathered their small bag. As they stepped off the plane, a rush of cool air swept through the jet bridge. Grace's breath caught. This was it, the first real moment in a place where no one knew her name. They walked in silence through the terminal. Grace kept a tight grip on Noah's hand, her eyes scanning every face, every sign, every exit. She didn't know where to go. Her phone had died sometime between security and the gate. The prepaid SIM had limited service anyway, and now she was left with nothing but a crumpled boarding pass and a child half asleep on his feet. She stood near a corner of the baggage claim, the world spinning just slightly, unsure of her next step. Are you waiting for someone? Lucas's voice came from behind her. Grace turned, startled. She hadn't even noticed him walking behind them. She shook her head. No, I don't know what I'm doing. Lucas didn't press. He just studied her for a moment, hands in the pockets of his jacket. I know a place, he said after a pause. It's not in the city. About an hour out. Quiet. No one around. You and your son could rest there. Just for the night. She hesitated, instinct tightening inside her like a fist. She didn't know this man. He was a stranger. Kind, maybe, but still unknown. Why would you offer that? She asked. Lucas looked her straight in the eye. Because I know what it's like to need somewhere to land, and because you look like you're out of places to run. Grace didn't answer. Instead, she looked down at Noah, whose head had leaned against her leg, his eyes heavy. He was tired. So was she. And something about Lucas's offer didn't feel threatening. It felt human. Just one night, she said. Lucas nodded. Just one. The drive north was almost surreal. As the city gave way to forests and winding roads, Grace leaned back in the seat of Lucas's older SUV, watching the landscape change. Noah fell asleep in the back, curled under her coat. The child hadn't even asked questions. He just trusted her completely. That made her ache more than anything else. Lucas didn't fill the silence with idle talk. Instead, he let the radio play quietly, some kind of acoustic playlist, soft guitar and hushed vocals. Grace found herself watching his hands on the steering wheel. They were steady, clean, a contrast to the frantic energy she had just escaped. Dota, you live out here? She asked quietly. Sometimes, he replied. It was supposed to be temporary. Then I forgot to leave. Grace turned toward the window. I used to want that, silence. Now that I have it, it's louder than I imagined. Lucas glanced at her, then back at the road. The silence only feels loud when we're carrying. Noise inside us. They didn't speak again for the rest of the drive. The cabin came into view like something out of a half-remembered dream. Nestled near a still lake surrounded by towering pines and mist, it looked untouched by time. The porch light glowed faintly in the early morning haze. A swing hung from an old tree. Smoke curled gently from the chimney. Grace didn't know what she had expected, but it wasn't this. Inside, the cabin was warm and worn, filled with books, soft rugs, and the faint scent of cedar. Lucas showed her the guest room, stocked with fresh sheets and towels. He handed her a spare phone charger and a mug of warm tea without a word. Noah barely made it to the bed before collapsing into sleep. Grace lingered by the doorway, unsure of what to say, of how to accept kindness without strings. Lucas stood in the living room folding blankets. He looked up at her, offering no explanation, no pressure. I'll be outside if you need anything. And then he disappeared into the soft hush of the breeze. For the first time in years, Grace stood in a place that did not demand anything of her. Not her obedience, not her silence, not even her story. She walked to the window, watching Noah sleep, his small chest rising and falling. And then, with trembling hands, she sat down on the edge of the bed. Outside, the world kept turning. Inside, something inside her had finally, gently begun to unclench. Not healed, not yet, but beginning. The first morning at the cabin came not with fear, but with silence. A kind of silence Grace had long forgotten. It wasn't the silence of tension, like the quiet before Jonathan would raise his voice or worse. This silence was clean, natural. It was the rustle of wind through trees, the slow creak of wood expanding in the sunlight, the gentle exhale of a world that wasn't watching her every move. Grace woke before Noah. For a long time she stayed still in the narrow guest bed, listening to the steady rhythm of her son's breathing beside her. He had fallen asleep the moment his head hit the pillow the night before, still wearing his shoes. She had loosened his laces and tucked him under the blanket, but hadn't dared wake him to change. His sleep felt sacred, undisturbed. She stood and pulled back the curtains. Morning had poured itself across the landscape in brush strokes of soft gold and silver mist. Pine trees framed the edges of the lake, and a deer stood motionless near the water, watching the world with the same cautious wonder Grace felt in her chest. She stepped quietly into the hallway, drawn by the faint aroma of coffee and something sweet, maybe cinnamon. The kitchen was small, framed by open shelves and light that spilled through the windows like liquid. Lucas stood at the stove, a faded plaid shirt rolled at the sleeves, barefoot, humming a tune she didn't recognize. He turned when he saw her, offering the softest of nods. "I made French toast," he said. "There's coffee too, or tea if that's better." His voice carried no expectation, just simple offering. "Coffee's perfect," Grace murmured, voice still rough from sleep. He poured a mug and set it gently in front of her at the wooden table. No questions, no lingering stares, just presence. Grace took a sip and let it settle in her chest. It was strong, a little bitter, grounding. "Did you sleep at all?" Lucas asked after a while. She hesitated, then nodded. "Better than I thought I could." He smiled faintly, almost like he understood that her answer meant more than she'd said. Later, when Noah awoke, he wandered into the kitchen with his hair sticking out in every direction, clutching his stuffed dinosaur and blinking at the strange, new world around him. Lucas crouched to his level and asked if he wanted syrup on his French toast, like it was the most normal morning in the world. And just like that, something loosened in Grace's chest. Because Noah smiled. A real one. Not the one he forced at school or the one she begged for on hard days. A pure, unfiltered smile. That afternoon, Lucas showed Noah how to build a small bird feeder out of pine cones, peanut butter, and seeds. The two of them worked side by side in the backyard while Grace sat on the porch, wrapped in a borrowed sweater, watching them with a quiet reverence. She hadn't known it could feel like this. The simplicity of safety. The softness of being seen without being studied. Lucas never asked what had happened. Never pushed for answers. He simply created space. And Grace slowly was learning to step into it. That night, after Noah had fallen, asleep again, curled tightly beneath a quilt, Grace found herself sitting across from Lucas by the fireplace. The air was filled with the scent of burning cedar and something else, something warmer, heavier. Memory maybe, or grief. Lucas was flipping through a sketch pad filled with drawings, nothing elaborate, mostly landscapes, cabins, trees. Grace leaned forward. "You draw?" "Not well," he said with a shrug, "but it helps me think." "Think about what?" He closed the book. About how things could have gone differently. Grace waited, unsure if she should ask. But then he spoke again. "My brother died 3 years ago," Lucas said, not looking at her. "Overdose. It was ruled accidental, but it wasn't. He was exhausted, pressured, alone. I was too caught up in work to see what was happening." Grace didn't breathe. "I was co-founder of a tech company," he continued. "We were growing fast, big investors, big egos. My brother worked for us. I thought I was giving him a future. Turned out I was giving him a cage." Grace looked down at her hands, fingers tightening around the ceramic mug in her lap. "I'm sorry," she said. Lucas nodded slowly. "Me too." For a long time, neither of them spoke. Just the fire cracking between them, the weight of pain, Carried too long and spoken too little. Then Grace whispered, "He made me feel small. Jonathan." At first it was just in words, little things, criticisms, jokes that weren't funny. Then came the rules: what to wear, who to see, what to say. After a while, I didn't even know what I liked anymore. I only knew what wouldn't make him mad. Lucas's face didn't change, but something in his shoulders shifted, like he was holding her words in a space of reverence. There were good days, she added, quickly, instinctively. Sometimes he was kind, thoughtful. He bought Noah toys, brought me flowers after, yelling, and I held on to those moments like they were proof I wasn't crazy. That maybe if I just did better, loved harder, it would stop. "It's not your fault," Lucas said, his voice firm but gentle. "You know that, right?" Grace's eyes shimmered. "I'm trying to believe that." Lucas looked at her then, not with pity, but with respect. The kind of respect you offer someone who's walked through fire and come out still standing. "I stayed for Noah," she said. "But then he saw it. He saw Jonathan hit me. He tried to protect me. And I realized I couldn't let him grow up thinking that was love." She looked toward the hallway where her son slept. "That night we left. I didn't know where we were going. I just knew I couldn't stay." Lucas nodded slowly. "You chose something incredibly brave." "I was terrified. And you did it anyway." She didn't reply, but her eyes said everything. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees. Inside, two broken people sat across from each other, not as saviors or projects, but as equals, witnesses to each other's survival. When Grace finally stood to leave, Lucas didn't stop her, didn't ask for anything more. But as she reached the doorway, she paused. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For letting me be quiet." Lucas nodded once. The words loud enough. In the days that followed, something shifted, not suddenly but slowly, like thawing ice. Grace began to move through the cabin like she belonged. She cooked breakfast one morning, eggs and toast, simple and comforting. She and Noah painted, rocks to line the edge of the garden path. He laughed when his turned out looking like a lumpy blueberry. Grace laughed too, the sound strange in her own ears, like a song she'd forgotten the words to. Lucas never intruded, but he was always there. He offered tools, time, silence. And somehow each of those offerings helped Grace remember that healing didn't always come in a rush. Sometimes it came in moments, a full night's sleep, a child's giggle, a mug of warm coffee waiting without request. One afternoon, Grace stood alone at the edge of the lake, wind in her hair, Noah's laughter echoing behind her. She closed her eyes and felt the earth beneath her feet, the weight of fear beginning to shift, not disappear, but move. For the first time in years, she wasn't just surviving. She was beginning to live. The morning Grace decided to return to the world was not marked by any dramatic moment. There was no thunderclap of realization or lightning strike epiphany. It was subtler than that. She was standing at the edge of the lake, watching Noah throw small pebbles into the water when it happened. The ripple each stone made reminded her of time, how far it travels, how deeply it touches even the calmest surface. And for the first time in what felt like years, Grace realized she wasn't afraid of the noise those ripples might cause. "I think I'm ready," she said later that evening as she sat on the porch beside Lucas, her voice carrying the weight of something decided. He looked up from the mug in his hand. "Ready for what?" "To go back," she said, her eyes on the horizon. "Not to him, never to that, but to the world, to life, to whatever's next." Lucas didn't answer right away. He just nodded once and said, "Then we'll find your next step." The next morning they drove back into the city, Grace, Noah and Lucas, toward a future they hadn't yet defined. The car was quiet, save for Noah's soft humming in the backseat. Grace's hands were steady for the first time in months. They arrived at a women's legal center in Vancouver that Lucas had found through a contact at a local shelter. Grace sat across from a woman named Priya, a lawyer with sharp eyes and a warmth that made Grace feel like she could breathe. "I want full custody of my son," Grace said, her voice firm, "and a restraining order against my husband. I have proof. I just didn't know what to do with it until now." Priya didn't blink. She nodded and reached for her notepad. "Then let's start." What followed was exhausting. Paperwork, interviews, meetings with counselors, safety planning. Grace had to revisit everything she had worked so hard to escape. But this time, she wasn't alone. Lucas stayed in the waiting room, reading to Noah, his quiet presence an anchor. He never pushed, never asked for details. He simply made sure they had space, and that when Grace walked out of those meetings, there was someone waiting who looked at her like she was whole. When the court date finally arrived, Grace stood in front of the judge in a modest blazer donated by the shelter. She held her breath as her lawyer laid out the evidence. Medical records, photos, witness statements, and the story of a mother who had risked everything to keep her child safe. Jonathan never showed. Grace hadn't known what to expect. Part of her had imagined him storming into the courtroom, demanding control, spinning lies with his polished voice and perfect reputation. But instead there was only silence. His absence said more than any argument could. He hadn't fought for them, not because he was letting go, but because he had never believed they would leave, because he had never imagined she would find the courage to choose herself. When the judge granted her full custody and issued a permanent restraining order, Grace didn't cry. Not there, not in front of the court. She waited until they stepped. Onto the steps outside the building, Noah's hand wrapped in hers and the sunlight hit her face like a benediction. "Are we really free now, Mommy?" Noah asked. She knelt in front of him, brushing his hair back, tears stinging her eyes. "Yes, baby," she whispered. "We are." Over the following weeks, Grace began volunteering at the shelter that had first welcomed her. At first, she offered to help organize donations and sort clothes, quietly blending into the rhythm of the place. But soon her presence began to shift the energy around her. Women gravitated toward her, sensing the steady calm behind her eyes, the way she listened without judgment, the way she smiled like someone who understood. She started reading to the children during counseling. Hours. Then she was asked to co-facilitate a support group. Her story wasn't something she ever wanted to tell, but she told it anyway. Not to relive it, but to release it. She told it in fragments, in metaphors, in the steady language of someone who had bled and healed and learned to stand. Other women began to share too, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. Because in Grace they saw something that felt impossible before, a version of themselves beyond the fear. One afternoon, as she was packing up after a peer group session, a volunteer handed her a small envelope. "This was dropped off for you," they said. Inside was a letter written in nervous, uneven handwriting. "Dear Grace, you don't know me, but I know your story. I was in the back of the room the night you spoke. I didn't say anything, I couldn't. But something in what you said stayed with me. I waited until he left for work. I took my son and we ran. We're at the shelter now in Kelowna. I don't have much, but I have air in my lungs again. Thank you. You were brave first. And because of that, I believed I could be brave too." Grace read the letter 3 times before she sat down in the hallway, overcome. The tears that came were not filled with sorrow. They were sacred, redemptive, a release of everything she had carried and everything she had become. That night, Lucas found her sitting on the back steps of the cabin, staring at the stars. He sat beside her without a word. "I got a letter today," she said. He waited. "It was from a woman I'll probably never meet. She left her abuser because she heard my story. And now, she's safe. Her child's safe." Lucas reached for her hand. "You did that," he said quietly. "No," Grace whispered. "We did. All of us who chose something better." She looked at him then, really looked. At the man who had offered her nothing but space, quiet, and the freedom to find her own strength. A man who had lost his brother and still carried that grief like a map to his own humanity. "I don't think I'm the same person who got on that plane," she said. Lucas smiled gently. "You're not. And I don't think I'm done yet," she added. "I want to do more. Build something that lasts. Not just for me, but for every woman who's ever sat in the dark waiting for a sign that it's safe to run." He nodded. "Then let's build it." Their eyes met, not with fire or urgency, but with clarity. It was time. Time to stop surviving and start creating. Time to turn safety into sanctuary. Time to transform pain into purpose. And Grace, for the first time, believed she could. 1 year after Grace Turner boarded the wrong plane with her son, and a heart heavy with fear, the world around her no longer resembled the one she had fled. Where there had once been dread, there was now breath. Where there had been bruises, on skin, on spirit, there was now bloom. And at the center of it all stood the nest, a house, Not built for rescue, but for renewal. Nestled in a quiet part of North Vancouver, the nest didn't look like much from the outside. A modest two-story house with white shutters, a winding garden path, and a wooden sign hand-painted in soft green letters. But inside it carried the weight of something sacred. It was a space that whispered, "You are safe here," not just in words, but in every corner, every breath of warmth, every woman who stepped through its doors and exhaled for the first time in years. The day of the open house arrived with early spring light pouring gently through the trees. The backyard was transformed into a space of celebration. White chairs lined the grass, soft music drifted through the air, and the garden beds, tended by women and children over the past months, were full of wildflowers, herbs, and the kind of color that only comes from healing hands. Grace moved through it all with quiet wonder. She wore a flowing ivory dress and a crown of daisies that her son Noah had helped make that morning. Her steps were unhurried. Every moment was deliberate. Every breath anchored her to the earth she had once feared she'd never touch with. Peace again. She had not done this alone. Lucas stood by the trellis arch at the far end of the yard, sleeves rolled, his hands tucked nervously into his pockets. He had arrived early to set up the chairs, string the lights, and fix a loose step on the porch, all with the quiet diligence he brought to every moment of this new life they were building together. Noah, now 7 and radiant with the kind of joy that only children who know they're safe can wear, darted through the crowd, handing out cups of lemonade and welcoming guests like a true host. His face was painted with a streak of glitter, and his laughter rang like a bell through the open space. The ceremony was never meant to be extravagant. Grace had made that clear from the beginning. "No flowers we don't grow ourselves," she'd said. "No speeches written by someone else. Just us. Real. Honest." So when the moment came, and the music softened, and Grace walked slowly down the aisle with Noah by her side, it felt more like a homecoming than a wedding. More like a promise to begin again. Not as perfect people, but as two souls who had found each other at the edge of ruin and chose to walk forward anyway. They stood under the arch as the breeze carried the scent of rosemary and lavender. The people in the chairs weren't just guests, they were witnesses. Women who had found shelter in the nest. Children who had slept in its beds and woke without fear. Volunteers, friends. A community not built from charity, but from shared understanding. Grace looked up at Lucas, her eyes soft, luminous. "I never believed I could have this," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Not after everything I lost, not after everything I had to run from. But you didn't try to fix me. You waited while I found my way. And when I couldn't speak, you listened anyway. You made room for me. And now I want to make room for us." Lucas's voice was quiet but clear. "I wasn't looking for anyone," he said. "After my brother died, I didn't think I deserved connection. I thought my silence was penance. And then you sat beside me on that plane, carrying more courage than I've ever seen. You taught me that starting over isn't weakness. It's faith. It's love. And it's a choice I want to make every day with you." There were no vows more rehearsed than that. No declarations for the sake of ceremony. Only truth. And when they kissed, it wasn't the culmination of a love story. It was the continuation of one. After the applause quieted and the music returned, Grace wandered inside for a moment of stillness. The common room of the nest was filled with mementos, photographs, handwritten notes from women who had come through, drawings by children taped along the walls. But what drew her attention now was a table near the window. Stacked there were copies of her book, The Day I Chose to Live, freshly printed and already dog-eared by the women who had read the early manuscript. The cover was simple, a watercolor of a mother and child walking toward an open horizon. The title was scrawled across it in Grace's own handwriting. She picked one up, tracing the edge of the page. The book had started as a journal, something private, but over time it had become something more, a collection of moments, of awakenings, of reminders that trauma does not erase worthiness. That starting over is not shameful but sacred, and that survival, in its most honest form, eventually leads to purpose. She felt a small tug at her skirt and looked down to find Noah. He held out a piece of paper. "Can I tell you what I wrote?" he asked. "Of course," she said, kneeling. Beside him, in crooked handwriting, he'd scribbled, "My family is me, my mom, Lucas, and the nest. We help people. That's our superpower." Grace felt tears rise. Not the kind that come from sorrow, but the kind that come from knowing you made it through. That you created something from the ashes that could carry others too. You're right, she whispered, pulling him into a hug. That is our superpower. As the sun set over the hills, the backyard of the nest remained full. Laughter drifted into the sky, and the smell of warm bread and fresh-cut herbs filled the air. Music played from a small speaker tucked near the garden, and the string lights above glowed golden against the dusk. Lucas took Grace's hand, and together they stood watching the people who had found healing in this place. People who, like them, had once believed they were broken beyond repair. You think we'll ever stop growing this? She asked. He looked at her and shook his head. Not a chance. Later that night, long after the last guest had left and Noah had fallen asleep under a quilt made by one of the women from the shelter, Grace sat by the window with a cup of tea. She looked out over the quiet garden, the stillness now a comfort, not a threat. Lucas joined her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. I got asked something during that interview yesterday, she said. They wanted me to describe our life now in one sentence. What did you say? She smiled. I said, we're not perfect, but we're real, and we are free. Lucas kissed her temple. That's more than most people ever find. Outside, the wind stirred the wind chimes gently. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called through the trees, and inside the house held its breath like it knew. This wasn't just the end of a chapter. This was the life they chose, one ripple at a time. Real people, real emotions, real love. Hit the bell icon so you never miss a moment that might just change your day or your life. Until next time, stay kind, stay strong, and keep believing in second chances. This is Fortune's Wrath, where every story is a journey home.